Just Transition
This meeting
Coalition.
is being recorded.
And we're all here tonight to talk about utility rate making and regulation. It goes without saying that all of our bills are too damn high, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about how rates get set, who sets rates, how does utility regulation work in Kentucky, and the ways that we can all be a part of that process. And I mentioned this before we went live and started recording, but if folks have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Feel free to come off mute. If you have things to add, that makes it a much better presentation instead of me just talking at you. So, feel free to weigh in. And like I was saying, there's a lot of really knowledgeable folks on the call tonight. So let's make it as interactive as we can. So just briefly, Kentucky Just Transition Coalition, we're a cross-sector coalition bringing folks together around climate, environmental justice, social justice, and labor, pushing for real solutions to the climate crisis that take care of workers in our communities in the transition. Our current members are the Kentucky Student Environmental Coalition, Rubbertown Emergency Action Team, Hood to the Holler, SEIU, IUE, CWA, and Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. So that's just a little bit about who we are, putting this on tonight. When thinking about putting this workshop together, folks are feeling the impacts of the decisions that our utilities are making and our regulators are making around our energy system every day. But in my experience, folks generally feel powerless in the situation. Right? Utility bills come and we either pay them or we can't pay them, right? And many people are unaware that the Public Service Commission is a regulatory body that's making decisions that are supposed to be fair, just, and reasonable, including affordability around our utilities. And that there is a public process that people can be a part of when it comes to the Public Service Commission setting our rates and regulating our utilities. And so this workshop is really designed to help us better understand the energy regulatory process and the ways we can get our voices heard. So I want to just kind of start with a little bit about the utility structure in Kentucky. So something of note is that most of our utilities are regulated monopolies. And so what this means is that and you all know this, right? Like, you can't shop around for who you buy your energy from in Kentucky. You live somewhere and you get your energy from the local provider. And so our utilities are granted the exclusive right to provide service in a service area. And in return for that right, their rates and their capital expenditures are regulated by our Public Service Commission. And this regulation is supposed to ensure that there's reliability of our service, that there's safety of service, and that there are fair, just, and reasonable rates. Something else to note is that in Kentucky, most of our electric utilities are what's called vertically integrated, which means that the electric utility owns the generation, the transmission, and the distribution of electricity. They're doing it all, right? And so this has implications on our utilities, right? And in the beginning, over 100 years ago, when we were first determining how to provide electricity to the country, it made sense. Electrification began in the mid to late 1880s, and about 50 years later, rural electric cooperatives came on board, also operating as monopolies to fill the gaps to bring electricity to rural communities. And so over 100 years has gone by where these utilities are operating without competition. And so it's really no surprise that our energy providers have not been responsive to what we need, that there's not been innovation, and because there's really been no pressure for them to change. But in the same time frame of over 100 years, we are different, right? And we have vast improvements in technology, and we found better ways to create, store, and transfer electricity. But really, the way that utilities are doing business has not kept pace with those improvements. It's remained much of the same over the last 100+ years. So let's talk just quickly about who owns our utilities, and I'm going to pause and just see if anybody in the audience has anything they feel important to add that I maybe missed. So really, ownership in Kentucky, there's really 4 different models at play. The first is investor-owned. So investor-owned utilities are owned by shareholders, and they're making decisions in favor of making profit for shareholders, not necessarily in the best interest of customers. And these investor-owned utilities are regulated in Kentucky by the Public Service Commission. Then we have cooperatively owned, right? So we mentioned rural electric co-ops. So these are owned cooperatively by all the customers or members of the co-op, and decisions are made in a quasi-democratic way, but they're often run very similarly to investor-owned utilities. And when I say quasi-democratic, like there's an opportunity for customers of co-ops to participate in the democratic process, but most folks don't know how, or they're not participating. These are also regulated by the Public Service Commission. Then we have municipal-owned utilities. So these are owned by the municipality, the city, and they should be making decisions in favor of low cost and reliable service for customers and residents. But they're not regulated by the Public Service Commission. And sometimes the lack of oversight leads to poor decisions around maintenance and upgrades. So there's definitely vast ways that municipally owned utilities can be improved as well. And then for folks out in the western part of the state, we have the Tennessee Valley Authority. And the Tennessee Valley Authority is actually a federally owned electric utility. And so they're regulated at the federal level. So really we have it all when it comes to ownership models, except for community owned, which may be the best model of all, right? So I'm going to go ahead and pause and just see if anybody wants to add anything, or if anybody has any questions up to this point. All right, so in exchange for their monopoly status, utilities are regulated by the state to ensure they don't take advantage of their customers or abuse their power. However, that regulatory system is not perfect, and the utility lobby is strong. So we're going to talk a little bit about that now. So investor-owned utilities, so if you have, KU, you have Duke, you have LG&E, these are investor-owned utilities. They cover a lot of the state. And investor-owned utilities make a guaranteed rate of return on electricity. So they have guaranteed customers and they have a guaranteed rate of return. And so that means when they build new infrastructure, like these 2 new gas plants that LG&E is proposing, they can charge us to build it. They make money on top of what it costs to build it. And then they turn around and they charge us for the electricity produced. And this is why you've seen our utilities, especially our investor-owned utilities in the state, really pushing back hard against rooftop solar for the last, 5-6 years. And that's because it's not that they're against solar, right? They just want to build giant solar facilities that they can make money off of and then charge us for the electricity. They don't want us to own it. And so this incentivizes building costly infrastructure and disincentivizes things like energy efficiency, rooftop solar, and grid maintenance, which all help us lower our bills and receive the most reliable service. But it doesn't have to be this way, right? So there are other models out there that exist. There are other ways to do this. There are even investor-owned utilities who are leading the way when it comes to energy transition and seeing the writing on the wall. And one example of that is the, and Chris, you might have to help me. How do you say this? This electric cooperative in Arkansas is a great example of they've really invested in energy efficiency and promoted rooftop solar over the past decade. And they've actually been able to lower rates for every customer by 4.5%. And so this argument that, energy efficiency and rooftop solar are expensive or they don't pay off for utilities is not a good argument, because now we've seen this proven model that these investments not only help customers, but they can help the utility and the entire community. Anybody want to take a shot at how you pronounce that? I know I'm going to butcher it, so.
It's called Ouachita Electric in Arkansas.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you. And all across the country, there's this growing movement for energy democracy where communities are coming together to build a new system and demand that our regulators and policymakers do the right thing. And so this conversation that we're having right now is happening all across the country around how do we have more of a say in our energy future, and how do we move away from a model that doesn't work for us anymore to something that really helps protect our communities, invest in our communities, lowers our bills, and fights the worst impacts of climate change. You all know this, right? We're in a historic moment where the choices that we make they matter. We have to take bold action to stop the worst impacts of climate change and to help people afford their energy bills right now. And according to the Yale Climate Study, most Kentuckians agree that action on climate is needed. And so, we're not alone in feeling this way. I'll pause again. Any comments, questions? Things to add? All right. So what does utility regulation look like? So I mentioned the Public Service Commission regulates our utilities. They regulate our investor-owned electric utilities, our rural electric co-ops, our water utilities, telecommunications, and broadband. They don't regulate our municipally owned utilities or our TVA customers. And they're really charged with considering the public interest and ensuring safe and reliable service at a reasonable price to customers while providing for the financial stability of utilities. And so the PSC really sees its role as managing both sides, the customer side and the utility side, to make sure that everybody's getting a fair deal, fair, in air quotes, right? PSC is a 3-person regulatory board appointed by the governor and confirmed by the legislature, and commissioners serve a 4-year term. So there's some politics at play here as well, right? Appointed by whoever the governor is, and then it has to be confirmed by the legislature. And right now we have just 2 commissioners on our PSC. So we have Kent Chandler, who's the current chairperson. He's been there about, I think, 2 or 2.5 years. And he's been actually really great to work with. He has a background in working at the Attorney General's office, intervening in Public Service Commission cases on behalf of customers. He was previously the executive director of the PSC, and he is both been appointed and confirmed. So he's solidly on the commission. Then we have a new commissioner, Commissioner Reagan, who is an interim commissioner. She has not yet been confirmed. And we've had a bit of an issue getting commissioners confirmed under the Governor Beshear's administration. Last year's legislature failed to confirm two appointees. And so the commission has been understaffed. And it's, yet to be seen whether this year's legislature will confirm Commissioner Reagan or not. And then we have this open seat that may or may not get someone appointed to it. What does the commission do? They approve rate making and new infrastructure. They also review and give feedback on utilities plans for the future. And I mentioned this a couple of times, right? They're asked to regulate in a way that's fair, just, and reasonable, but it's incredibly ambiguous. There's no definition, there's no working definition for what fair, just, and reasonable is. So the commissioners have a lot of leeway in how they interpret that, and we see that play out depending on the commission or depending on the administration. They're a quasi-judicial board, which means that they're trying to be seen as impartial, and they're making decisions based on past precedent and evidence entered into cases. And so that means that in every rate case and every case around building new infrastructure, there has to be evidence entered into that particular case to be considered in decision making, which means that us being a part of the process is really important, because if we're not part of the process, they're only getting evidence from utilities, and they can only make their decisions based on evidence. And the commission has to be careful in the way that they make decisions, because utilities can challenge it in court if they don't like a decision, and we've seen that happen. Some issues, right? And I feel like I've already kind of mentioned some of these. Under-resourced, the commission is continually not given its full budget by the legislature. They're understaffed. They don't have a full set of commissioners right now. They're accountable to both the governor and the legislature, right? If they want to be reappointed and reconfirmed, that matters. Excuse me. And so we see that play out as well. We're also seeing it play out in that the legislature is potentially responding to good decisions happening at the PSC by introducing bad legislation. And we'll talk more about some proposed bad legislation that we're anticipating this year later. The PSC has been traditionally very reactive. Excuse me. So utility comes and asks for a rate increase. They come and ask for, to build something, and then the PSC responds to that, as opposed to really being proactive and having a vision and leading us somewhere in terms of our energy future. And it's not set up to engage the public well. And the public representation piece is tricky, expensive, and lacking. And so for any of you who've tried to participate in a rate case or an integrated resource plan comment period, you know that they don't make it easy for us to do that. And there's a lot of room for growth. I'll pause again. Questions, comments, reactions?
One thing I'll mention that's just kind of coming top of mind for me is just because they have to be, impartial and just solely looking at the evidence for their cases. They have their the evidence provided from the utilities, which are, in a lot of our areas, especially the investor-owned utilities, money-making entities that have the power and the resources to engage with tons of experts and gain lots of evidence and use all of the power that they have to make the data and models that work for them. And when it comes to interventions from community members and people who are experiencing the high energy bills and experiencing the injustices of this energy system, they don't necessarily have those same resources to create a stack of evidence that stacks up with what the utilities are able to provide.
Yeah, thanks for adding that context, Julie. Does anybody else have anything they want to add? And we will get through this before the end of the hour, so I am expecting folks to engage in some conversation at the end of this. So if you want to save your questions for the end, that's great too. And I just want to kind of briefly talk about, like, what does the process look like, right? So the process around rate making, and this is similar to the process around new infrastructure and other things that the PSC works on, but utilities initiate the process by submitting an application. The PSC opens a docket to examine the request, and then the PSC gathers evidence and makes a decision, right? And the evidence can come from the utilities, it can come from any intervening party, and it can come through public comment. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about intervention and public comments. So when it comes to public representation, there's really three options for how we get considered as the public in this process. There's the formal the formal venue of intervention. And so the Attorney General's Office of Rate Intervention, that's a part of the Attorney General's office, and their job is to intervene on behalf of customers. That's not just residential customers, it's also industrial customers. And again, Attorney General is a political position, right? It's a partisan position. And so depending on who the Attorney General is, we see varying degrees of good intervention in that process. And then we have public advocates who can intervene if they choose to do so. And so when I say intervention, what I mean is that you request from the Public Service Commission to be at the table with utilities during the entire process. And so folks who intervene, either public advocates or the Attorney General's office, bring expert witnesses. They have to have lawyers representing them. They're able to ask questions directly of the utilities and get responses to those questions. And so there's a lot of weight behind that kind of representation, because you really get to be a part of the whole process and help guide the conversation. And then we have informal public representation, which is our public comment periods. And every case, you can submit written public comments throughout the entire case. And usually there's time for oral public comment at the beginning of the formal hearing that happens towards the end of the case. It used to be that we saw, under different commissions, we saw oral comment hearings happening in person. Since the beginning of COVID, we haven't been seeing that happen. We haven't been seeing oral comment periods happening as often. And, they happen at 9 a.m. at the beginning of a hearing during the work week, right? So it's very hard to turn out people to come to the oral comments. But written comment is, if you know how to submit it, is fairly simple to do. And then there's a lot of issues along with this, right? So like I said, AG's office doesn't always do a good job. Formal intervention is time intensive and costly, requires hiring a lawyer, hiring expert witnesses, reading and understanding the application, which is like hundreds of pages of technical, jargon. And so what we've seen really be successful lately is having multiple public advocacy organizations coming together and intervening jointly so that we can share those costs and share those time restraints. And then the technical nature makes public comment really hard, right? There's no one who's really translating what's in these applications so that the public can understand what it even really means. And so on the advocacy side, we're spending a lot of time learning how to understand the technical nature and then translating it so that we can communicate out to the public. But that really shouldn't be our job, right? That should be the Public Service Commission's job. Public comment periods, are not well advertised. I should say not well advertised. The onus is on the utility companies to advertise when these things are happening. And so they put it in tiny print in a local newspaper. They maybe include it in your bill. But who looks at and reads their bill every month? So they're not well advertised. People don't know that it is happening. And public comment isn't always taken seriously. That's another place where there's a lot of subjectivity in terms of who the commission is and whether they're paying much attention to what's in the public comment or not. And again, they're charged with making decisions based on evidence. And so, just general opinion isn't really super helpful necessarily for them in the decision-making process. And so we have to really figure out how can we make public comments as effective as possible. I'll pause again.
Hey, this is Chris. Just wanted to add timelines. Timelines are crazy. Some administrative cases, we get about a week to decide whether to intervene. And in the best case scenario, I think it's about 4 weeks. And then we have to wait and see if the PSC will allow us intervention status That's not a given. Former public service commissions have denied us intervention status. And then once you get that, then you're back on the clock for as few as a couple more weeks to start your filings and get into the very technical and difficult legal proceedings. So I remember when I heard that you had to have a lawyer to intervene, and I said, that's crazy. And now I know you couldn't even begin to think about intervening without a good lawyer. So the burden and the hurdles are high.
Yeah.
Chris,
Thanks for that, Chris.
Chair, if I could, this is John. A couple of other things too, what Chris mentioned, or what was mentioned about the lawyer. You need an environmental lawyer who understands energy law. It's not something just any lawyer can pick up and say, oh, here's the definition. It's actually a specialist, and there's only a handful around the state of Kentucky that are even qualified to really go into that part of the process. The other thing that also that is really important that people need to be aware of, we had a legislator this past session who filed a bill that would have given the PSC the ability to cut the timeline on rate cases from 6 months to basically about 6 to 8 weeks with no public intervention and no interveners allowed. It took the power completely away from the public and from I serve as vice president of Kentucky Solar Energies Association. Our association would not be able to step in as an intervener representing our customers and clients in this particular format. Now, fortunately, it didn't get any traction last year. I haven't heard if it's going to be refiled this year or not, or whether they're going to change the language and try to make it work again. But it basically strips consumer presence and consumer protection away from the PSC process and the intervention process. So kind of keep your eyes and ears open for that. It's really critical to keep that available to us.
Yeah, thanks, John. And we have heard that we can expect similar legislation this year. So we're gearing up for that fight as well. So this all sounds really dismal, right? Like, gosh, this all sucks. What are we gonna do about it? There's all sorts of potential threats on the line. Like when the PSC makes a good decision, utilities can challenge it in court, and they can lobby the legislature to take away the power of the PSC, which we saw happening last year, right? There were commissioners weren't confirmed, and we don't know whether that was, because the legislature wanted to get back at the governor for appointing them, didn't want to confirm their appointees, or if it was because we've seen some decent decisions come out of the PSC and the legislature is being pushed by the utility lobby to, not let those things happen. We've seen conversation and potential bills that would limit the power of the PSC. The legislature sets their budget. They could, reduce their budget, change their scope. Some states, the Public Service Commission doesn't regulate rural electric cooperatives. So the legislature could say, like, hey, if you don't have the capacity to do all this, we'll just take those off of the regulatory, you don't have to do that anymore, which would be a huge loss for customers across the state. And then we are anticipating legislation that's alternative rate making legislation, or ARMS for short, which could be good. Like alternative rate mechanism could be good, but we're not anticipating a good one. We're anticipating a bill that will strip PSC power and consumer opportunity to participate in the rate making process. So like I said, we're gearing up for that. In a way that quote unquote streamlines rate increases, right? So stay tuned for that. But there's lots we can do. So we can engage as much as possible in the public comment process, and we can push for more information and opportunities to engage. We know that public representation matters. And if you do, a Google search over the last couple of years, you'll see a lot of articles around the work that's being done in Kentucky around engaging folks at the Public Service Commission. And some good decisions, like I said, being made. So we had a good decision around rooftop solar come from the PSC, and that was directly related to overwhelming public comment and our public advocacy organizations jointly intervening in the formal process. Like this headline, Kentuckians demand utility regulators consider climate change in long-term planning. Like we're shifting the conversation around what's happening at the Public Service Commission. So many public comments, like record numbers of public comments over the last couple of years, so much so that LG&E felt the need to publicly respond to our comments, which is a great thing, right? Because they're not ignoring us anymore, right? They felt like they needed to make a statement about these record number of comments being not, quote unquote, not constructive. And we've seen, coming out of LG&E's recent 15-year plan that nobody was happy with the poor planning that LG&E did. And again, that's part of, that statement coming out of the Public Service Commission has a lot to do with the really great work that we've been doing around public representation. And so if folks want to stay more in the loop around what you can do and be a part of the process of engaging at the PSC and holding utilities accountable in this way, you can follow our friends at Kentuckians for Energy Democracy, who are running a Public Service Commission reform campaign. And there is a lot of opportunity to be engaged in that process. So really that kind of wraps up the content for tonight, and that was 30 minutes, which is awesome. I'll just mention, kind of what's coming up for Kentucky Just Transition Coalition, and then we can, I can stop sharing my screen and we can just have a conversation about things that are coming up for folks. If people have questions, I'm happy to hang out for the rest of the hour. I'm sure some other folks are too. So let's make the most of it. So I mentioned, early on in this call that we've been kind of doing these informational workshops, and then we've been following up with conversation workshops, like where we're just talking and digging in deeper. And so we had a really great turnout and conversation in a climate resiliency workshop last year. So we're planning a follow-up conversation on January 24th at 6 p.m. Eastern. If folks really want to talk about, like, what does climate resiliency mean? What could that look like in our communities? What tools are available to us? I'm sure we'll talk to you a little bit about Inflation Reduction Act and how we can utilize some of those programs around climate resiliency. And then we're really too, as a coalition, wanting to dig into the Inflation Reduction Act to better understand how we can influence utilities to do the right thing, how we can lower our electric bills, how we can fight climate change, and how we can make sure that communities are a part of shaping the programs that are coming out of the IRA, and being really a part of shaping to make sure that the programs that do come out are beneficial for our communities, that they're helping low-income communities and folks who are on the front lines of energy extraction in Kentucky. And so that's what we got coming up. Appreciate y'all being here tonight. I hope you learned something useful. I'll go ahead. I'm gonna, like I said, stop sharing my screen.
I'll go ahead and read. Earlier in the chat, it was I believe it was from Manuel Vanderpool asked, is there a rebate / cost sharing model like how credit unions operate? And Carrie, you can take this one, but I also, what came to mind for me was a pay as you save program. And I also know that Chris Woolery on the call is very knowledgeable about, the possibilities there and the real opportunities for mutually beneficial programs with utilities and for customers that we have there, but also the challenges that we faced in implementing that in Kentucky.
Yeah, it made me think of a rural electric co-op. That's just like a credit union, because all of the people that are served by the co-op actually are member owners. And if they know how to access that power, they can vote for directors and influence decisions at the co-op.
If they know how to exercise that power is the operative saying there.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, if you want to see how's my co-op stacking up with its peers around the state or even around the region, you can check out energydemocracyall.com, and you can see some rural electric cooperative scorecards and also access the information from your particular co-op, such as their 990s or their board information or how to vote or attend an annual meeting or a board meeting.
And we're so thankful to have Corey on the call tonight. And Corey just recently moved into a new position at Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, organizing solely around rural electric co-ops and engaging rural folks around energy democracy. And so if you're not following KFTC, you should be. And I think you can probably anticipate a lot more ways to get engaged with your co-op and learn more about rural electric co-ops there too. So lots of good work happening. I see a question about how to go about setting up more community-owned and operated energy systems. So in Kentucky, it's actually illegal to have what's called third-party ownership of energy resources. And so we can't have a traditional community-owned solar farm like some states do. And so we need some legislative changes really to see some of that happen. But there are like a million programs in the Inflation Reduction Act, and one of them would allow cities and municipalities to create microgrids, like small grids, and potentially community-owned solar or other energy resources. And so that could be something that folks might want to organize around at the local level. And like I said, we'll be planning some more workshops to help people better understand what's in the IRA coming up.
I'll also say on the topic, I'm glad you brought that up, Angela, about community-owned solar, because there's also, programs from, for example, our favorite investor-owned utility, LG&E and KU, that are kind of more branded as community-owned solar. But, you really have to be careful with the investor-owned utilities because at the end of the day, per the statutes of the laws that they're functioning under, they are, required to make money, and especially for these additional programs that they really don't see as core to their energy generation, which is their large-scale solar projects. So when you're buying into their solar share or their other community-owned solar projects, there is a surcharge, and you are really paying for the additionality of that solar energy that you wouldn't really be paying if our rates were equitable and fair, because we know that solar now is the one of the cheapest energy options we have out there. So yes, we want community-owned solar, and that is there's a lot of possibilities and hopefully some additional funding coming in, but we also have to be wary, especially when we're operating under these utilities that aren't necessarily working in our interest.
Yeah, and then there's a question here around, can you start a co-op in an area where an investor-owned monopoly operates? In Kentucky, you cannot.
Here, if I could.
Sure.
There is a way of doing that, but you have to get permission from the utility to contract to do that, at which point you'll essentially be even though you're consumer-owned, you have to have a negotiated rate with the utility company. They can grant permission to do that as a monopoly. There is a way of doing that, but there's a lot of red tape you've got to go through to do it, including PSC approval. But we're actually working with a group right now that's trying to put that together down in Southern Kentucky. And they're working with East Kentucky Power, essentially. So I don't know how it's going to play out yet. We've been helping them design the system, and there have some other individuals that are doing the footwork with EKP. But the other thing too, anything that's over 45,000 watt net metering automatically goes to East Kentucky Power, regardless commercial, domestic, whatever it is. But if you're over the 45,000 watt net metering mark for solar installations, or other renewables. It's not just solar. It could be hydro, could be gas generation, any of the other renewable processes. Then you have to go to the PSC and you have to have written permission and legal contracting, for that matter, with the controlling power company for that monopoly area, that area that's assigned. But it is doable. I don't know how profitable it's going to be yet. That's still a wait and see situation. But it is doable. And there is money from the IRA 2020 to back that up to help get that done. So it's kind of an interesting process. I'm learning a lot right now about that whole process.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing, John. So it sounds like technically it's possible, but we'll see how that plays out here.
Hopefully by the end of the month, I'll have some more information for you all on how that's working. That we'll know something probably in the next 30 days.
Cool. Great. Other questions or thoughts or things that come up for folks? Anything you learned that was surprising or interesting?
I'll just throw into the hat. We've been hearing some, rumoring here in Louisville about people getting interested in municipalization, which is a mouthful, but that's just kind of something to keep our eye on. Getting an alternative sort of electrical system implemented with people not happy with LG&E.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you live in a place, like Louisville, that has a commitment, the local government has a commitment to renewable energy, and the investor-owned utility is not moving quick enough, something like municipalization could potentially be a workaround. Roxanne, do you have something you want to say?
I was going to ask you, you said the IRA was going to facilitate municipalization in some way, or will make it easier. What do you know about that?
Very little. There's so much in the IRA. I feel like I know very little about a lot of things. And they're rolling out the programs kind of piecemeal, right? And so I haven't heard, and other folks are looking into this too, the IRA, and better understanding it. So other folks maybe have more. I think that it has to be specifically for like low income or impacted communities. Or it can be used in that way. I don't know. I don't know enough to actually speak about it.
Okay, we'll have to find out more about that.
Yeah, I do know that like there are some people who are excited about using the IRA to potentially take like neighborhoods off the grid and create microgrids, or like census tracts. So doing small scale stuff that would go through the city government to do that. But I don't know more than that.
Okay.
Cool. Anybody else? Questions?
I'll say that like just another layer to really consider for all this is we're working within the energy system that we have with our municipal electricity municipalities and the rural electric co-ops and the investor-owned utilities, all regulated by the PSC, except the TVA and except the municipalities. But there's also levels of government that do have, specific control over projects that are implemented in their area, not necessarily over the electricity, but many of us today were at the hearing at Bully County for the LG&E pipeline that's going through. So that is, has been heard by the PSC and, is going through the approvals there, but there's also, local courts and local permits that they need, national permits. Our utilities are still regulated by federal agencies for their air quality and the air pollution they're putting out. So there's different layers to consider besides the PSC, but the PSC is the one that is supposed to be working within our public interest to make sure that our energy rates are just and reasonable and working for us. And so that's something that is a main portion of the this huge system that we've really been looking at and potentially seeing how it can work even better for us.
Yeah, the short answer is like it's complicated, right? But in some ways, the complicatedness can play to our advantage.
Just to like talk a little bit more about the PSC and kind of like what we can expect us just going in as regular folks. I'd never been to a meeting before I moved into this position with KFTC. And it definitely is kind of daunting. And even as a utility customer, like figuring these things out are it's just confusing and hard, and who has time for it? But we have obviously, you know, as Kara shared, the utilities are paying attention to us showing up, and the PSC is paying attention. And the thing to know right now, which really is unfortunate, is that the PSC is regulating these utilities, but the utilities aren't following the rules. So, for example, like Julie talking about these new gas plants and pipelines, those are things that should have been they should have let us know in their PSC case a few months back, and they didn't. So there are things that the utilities are doing right now that we should be calling them on, we should be paying attention to, and kind of dipping your toe into the PSC. I know it can be overwhelming, but it is worth it because there's so much we have to learn, and it's kind of it's our time to get in there and start working with these lawyers who have been leading this for so long. Lawyers are amazing. I might even want to be one day, but they shouldn't be the only voices in the room when we're the ones who have $400 utility bills while they're up there talking about no plan to lower them. So.
Yeah, thanks for that, Corey. And I'll just also really, mention, like I said, Kent Chandler is our currently fully appointed commissioner, and he's been really decent to work with. We're seeing him ask really hard questions of the utilities, and hearing a lot from utilities in these cases, well, we never had to do that before. We never had to have a real plan before. Why are you making me have a real, we never had to back up our data with where it came from. And so we have an opportunity right now, while we have a decent commissioner, to do more at the Public Service Commission than we ever potentially have before. And while he's interested in being around again for another term, we don't know who the governor's going to be when it's time for reappointment. We don't know, so we have an opportunity right now to do a lot at the Public Service Commission. We need to take advantage of that. And we need to get as many decent decisions on the books now that we can hold future commissions accountable to. And so now is really an important time to be engaging in this energy democracy at the PSC work. And there are a lot of things we need fixed at the legislative level, and that's just not going to happen for us right now, right? So we have to focus on the areas where we can have some influence, and the Public Service Commission is one of those places.
I noticed a question on here about grid vandalization, and are the utilities working on adopting any emergency preparedness and such. I had lunch just a few days before Christmas with one of the presidents of one of the regional co-ops, and I can tell you factually, yes, they're very concerned about it. And not just the local co-ops, this is across the nation. It is a topic that the utility grade engineers are looking at very carefully, and quite honestly trying to figure out what they can do to prevent some of these things or how to handle it better. The grid is just such an immense machine, and it really is a machine. And it's the U.S. electric grid is probably the largest machine in the entire world as far as how it operates. So it's an incredibly complex and difficult problem for them to have to try to come up with solutions for before they have the issues. Right now, probably the biggest thing as consumers we can do, if you hear or see or hear wind of somebody that's saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing something to vandalize the system, let the appropriate people know. Don't hold that back because it is vulnerable. I mean, there are things that can happen that can be pretty devastating to the U.S. grid without as much problem as some people think. But I can tell you the local utilities and regional utilities are definitely concerned about it. And it is something on the back of, I won't even say the back of their mind, it's something on their mind, on how they can, protect their substations and protect their utility base.
And it's something that we can bring up in these cases with the Public Service Commission in terms of providing, questions and evidence for things that the utilities should be thinking about, right? So I dropped a couple things in the chat. They've probably been shared already, but if you want to find out more about Kentuckians for Energy Democracy and get involved directly with PSC related work in Kentucky, k4ed.org. There's an individual sign on. You can sign on to support the campaign. You can contact them through that link. And then if you have any specific questions that we didn't get to tonight and you want to reach out, you can email us at kyjusttransitioncoalition@gmail.com. There are a lot of really smart people, a lot of people who spend a long time learning the ins and outs of how these things work so that we can be better prepared to fight at the Public Service Commission. And so, if we don't know the answer, we can connect you with somebody who does. So, bring on the questions. Happy to help field them. And then, if this is something folks are interested in continuing to talk about or go deeper on some of these, individual questions, we can always schedule another time that's just for us to chat and won't have me talking at you for 30 minutes first. So. Any other last things folks want to share or bring into the space before we call it a night?
Can I mention one quick last thing? We work with customers obviously on a daily basis who are interested in putting solar in their houses. And obviously we hear a lot about people complaining about their electric bill. Remember that you generate your bill. The power company charges you for the power that you're using. So the quickest way to start reducing your bill is just reduce your consumption. And we talk to a lot of our customers about their energy usage and how they're doing it. Chris has got a full-time career dealing with people doing that and does an exceedingly good job. But, it's something we have to remind our customers routinely that you make your own electric bill. If you get a $500 or $600 bill, it's you use that much electricity. It's not all on the utility. Part of it's on you about, turning off the lights, maybe turning the heat down a few degrees, putting on an extra sweater or whatever. But these are all things that, come back to you at the end of the month in your utility bill. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but your cell phone chargers, your cable box, all those kind of things you leave plugged in day after day after day, it adds to your bill. And, it could be as much as $10 or $15 a month, depending on how many you have plugged in or what you have. And that adds up over the course of a year. So, those are little things that are easy to do. Pretty much anytime I do public speaking engagements, that's one of the first things I start with is remember you generate your own bill. So, keep those things in mind about your home and business, what you're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John. And I think to some extent that's true, right? And to some extent folks are working with, very inefficient housing that they don't have control over,
I think poor folks and renters especially are the very best I've ever seen at budgeting their own electricity. Folks know how to keep their bill low. A lot of the time it's that, we live in homes that are old or they're new and they weren't built right. We don't have the nice heat pumps. We don't have the windows that block the cold, things like that. So when we see a winter storm, it really is up to our utilities to make sure that they're implementing these programs that they talk about. They make sure that they get these energy efficiency programs to us because that is what will lower our bill on the long term and on the large scale.
Yeah, and there are a lot of incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act around energy efficiency, and a lot of them are geared towards homeowners who have, disposable income, right, who can go out and buy something and get a tax rebate. And we're really trying to, at Kentucky Just Transition Coalition, better understand how to make those programs applicable to renters and low-income folks, and how do we put programs in place to ensure that the folks who need those energy efficiency upgrades the most get access to them. And so it's both, right? And we got to figure out how to make it work for everybody, especially the folks who are struggling the most to pay their bills.
If I could add one more thing just on that wonderful note, that with our as Corey had been talking about earlier with the LG&E had their integrated resource plan, or IRP, that wasn't necessarily taking into account everything that they wanted to do with the plans that they've now announced with the new natural gas plants. They also had filed for their newest slate of energy efficiency programs, and a lot of us believe that those energy efficiency programs aren't as much as they really could be doing or should be doing, in the case that they also had to build so much more capacity for their operations. So so there's definitely a lot that our customers could be doing to decrease their energy bills, but there's also a lot that the utilities could be doing to also help with energy efficiency, with especially in our older homes that we have across Kentucky, and the homes that we have to rebuild across Kentucky in the wake of our climate disasters that we've seen. So that's something to keep in mind, is that we all over we could be doing more for energy efficiency, and that's something that we need to build back resilient and better than ever. And that's something that is also regulated at the PSC level, is their energy efficiency programs.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that, y'all. Lots of work to be done. Lots of opportunity to do really good work. And I appreciate all y'all coming tonight to talk about utilities and rate making, and start to better understand some of this wonky stuff so that we can make sure our voices are heard in the process. Like I said, feel free to reach out, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever you're at. If you have ideas for future conversations you'd like to have, or workshops you'd like to see, reach out. We're happy to make those things happen for folks. We want to engage around the issues that are important to you. So let us know what those are, and have a great evening, great rest of your week. Stay warm, stay safe, stay healthy. Appreciate y'all.
Thanks, Carrie. Great job.
Thanks, y'all. Have a great night.